the crony lending happened for a period. Actually, banks continued to not reveal some of the bad debt, etc. But sometimes I say, no, we have to clean up, and clean up happened. Another difference, if you look at India, if you take the proportion of GDP, right, about 58 to 60% of our GDP comes from consumption. In China, much smaller proportion of their GDP comes from consumption. They have relied far more on external consumption. Having seen and interacted with the best, I have absolutely no hesitation in having the highest level of admiration for our country's Prime Minister.
Since you are representing these countries, you are in touch with the leaders of this country. Tell us something interesting that you have learned or caught up by observing the leaders of this country, and especially maybe our Prime Minister Narendra Modi, because you work closely with him.
That I think is, for me, I will always regard as one of my biggest privileges, which is to work really closely with the Hon'ble Prime Minister. You would have, those of you who would have seen when I put out my statement saying that I will not be seeking an extension as the CEA, written about all the people that I got to work with, have the highest regard for the Hon'ble Prime Minister. As we were discussing earlier, I've been lucky enough to have seen the best in the world. The best in the world include maybe a dozen Nobel laureates and top policymakers, many top corporate honchos, and some national leaders as well. Before I came to the IMF, I actually had seen primarily India's leaders, but in the current role, other nations' leaders as well. But having seen and interacted with the best, I have absolutely no hesitation in having the highest level of admiration for our country's Prime Minister. So first thing is actually, in my interactions with him, I have seen intent. The intent to actually change the country. That is something that I relate with very, very well, because I'm also incredibly passionate about positively changing the country. In that sort of, seeing someone with that kind of intent, there was a warm glow that I would feel. There are occasions I would actually, I'm telling you, as I sort of go and meet him, and this is the way he designed, where when I met him, typically it was one-on-one, and I'd make a presentation, and after the presentation I'd come back and and think that, I have to work harder. Imagine that if you are feeling inspired, saying that I was working very hard, but I need to work harder. That is what a leader is, right? Who basically inspires you to. It is because of the intent that you see, that that intent to make a difference, which I could identify with. As I said, nothing gives me as much satisfaction as having the opportunity to make a difference in a positive way. By working with the Hon'ble Prime Minister, I got that opportunity. And I think that's something which I really feel very, very happy about. A few other things, one is that I actually, my own experience, I felt very valued and very respected. On occasions, there have actually been presentations that have gone, beyond an hour sometimes, and he wants to learn. He is somebody who is the best listener that I have actually seen by far. Best listener by far. So best listening is there are some very good listeners who maybe the first 15, 20, maybe 30 minutes of a conversation, maybe 40 minutes of a conversation, they'll remain fully engaged, right? But maybe after the 40 minutes, maybe they're getting tired, or maybe their own ability to process now is actually dwindling. So you can start noticing in their body language that they may either be tiring out, or maybe they're actually getting bored, or maybe it could be any combination of. But with the Hon'ble Prime Minister, I've actually seen that he listens so intently, so carefully, and in his body language you cannot make out actually that he's lost interest, or it's not just actually that he's hiding that with his body language, because even 50 minutes or maybe an hour and a half into a presentation as well, he will ask you a question that actually is which tells you clearly that he's engaged. He's engaged. That and I think, in my opinion, for a leader, it's true for any individual, but it's far more true for a leader to be a very good listener, because no one can actually know everything everything. And having the humility to know what you do not know and therefore you want to learn, I think is a very, very important attribute of a leader. I've seen, as I said, others. There are others who actually will come in thinking that they know it all. It's like बाल्टी में पूरे, यदि आप सोचो पूरा पानी भरा हुआ है तो उसमें आप कुछ नया पानी डाल ही नहीं सकते, राइट? यदि आप उसमें आप आइडेंटिफाई करो कि नहीं ये पार्ट है, इसमें एक्चुअली अभी भरा नहीं है, इसमें और मुझे भरना है और ज्ञान भरना है, तब जाके आप एक्चुअली बहुत ध्यान से सुनोगे. एंड it is that intent to contribute which is what makes him really listen so carefully. And as I said, I felt extremely valued and extremely respected, and I think that's the combination. Of course, people talk about, and I've seen this as well. I've been in meetings where meetings that have started at, let's say, 9:30 in the morning. I've also been in meetings which have actually ended at 11:30 in the night. The level of energy remains the same. I think Secret Sauce, is a sadhana that he does. That is what actually, the energy that comes. And I myself actually, because as I was telling you, 2 months before the economic survey, I would make sure that I was actually every day getting my, because I didn't want to, sort of lose my cool or, get stressed. Because one thing that I genuinely believed was that, creative work requires a happy mind. And the economic survey work is creative work, and the entire team, therefore I did not want to be the instrument to make them unhappy by shouting or losing my so therefore I maintaining my calmness, and that required me to actually keep my energy level high. So I can relate, therefore, that it is that energy comes from the spiritual practices.
One thing which remained unanswered was India is at the same cusp where China was in 1980s, and they were reaping all those dividend picks, but after 2 decades all fall down.
Yeah.
सब लोग कह रहे India का decade.
Yeah.
But how do you think we are going to sustain this growth and not see the fall?
So it's important to understand, to answer that question, you have to understand what was the model that China followed, right? One thing is that the demographic dividend came to them, because of years of population growth.
Right.
Then they introduced this one-child policy. So, they had in the 1980s, they had the demographic dividend because population had grown. Now they're actually in a situation where the workforce is going to decline by 300 million in the next couple of decades. It's because of that one-child policy, right? So here you contrast it to India. We are a democracy. You can't basically, and I'm thankful that India is a democracy, and therefore such inhumane measures like one child policy, etc. We don't do. We do it in organic ways. So in that sense, I think that kind of discontinuity in population that China is seeing is something that we will not see. Number one, there will be sort of the next 25-30 years will be when our demographic dividend will be the most solid. Population will basically become older because overall life expectancy is increasing. People are having less kids. That's all organic phenomena that is happening. So that's the second part is actually, so as I said, the demographic dividend is what enabled them to sort of follow a policy where they utilize labor, the surplus labor, so that costs being actually kept low. The other part was that a lot of the investment that was done. So it was mostly sort of top down in the sense that centralized party deciding what to do, and as a result they're looking at a ton of bad investment now, and that is something India has already gone through and learned its lessons from.
For example,
if you take the crony lending that happened till 2013, starting from about 2007-8 to 2013, we went through that entire phenomena where banks lent to a lot of bad assets got created, and the overhang that comes from such bad lending, the impact on growth, we've seen that. So we've sort of learned those lessons, of not therefore having a sort of there was basically sort of a decision taken that public sector banks will go and lend to infrastructure. It was just a decision that was taken in a similar way to what has happened in China as well. And we again in India, pre-2014, and then the impact of that, actually the overhang because of such bad decisions before 2014, and in China over the last sort of decade or so, we've seen how bad investment, actually the overhang of that is terrible. So my sense is, I think we've definitely learnt our lessons, and having written an economic survey chapter on this, I hope people will keep remembering, not repeat the mistakes before pre-2014 mistakes of crony lending, etc. in India. So which is why I think that the growth that we will have will not be, it won't have the discontinuity, the demographic discontinuity that China is facing, nor will it face some of the enormous amounts of bad assets that have been created, or sort of ghost assets that have been created in China because of bad lending. So I think that's where the difference will be. Also, I think another difference, if you look at India, if you take the proportion of GDP, right, about 58 to 60% of our GDP comes from consumption. In China, much smaller proportion of their GDP comes from consumption. They have relied far more on external consumption, which is basically they produced for consumption by other economies, through the export powerhouse, basically. Right. Which is why their domestic consumption, despite the domestic consumption not being as high, they were still able to grow by basically producing for the rest of the world. In contrast, India actually, of course, we want to produce for the rest of the world as well on the export front. But we have a very large middle class coming in as well, and and growing. So a lot of consumption actually will happen domestically as well. So and therefore our need for those 47, 48% investment in GDP is not, we don't need that much. If we actually get to even 35, 36%, or maybe closer to 40% as investment to GDP, I think that's a sweet spot. So again, there are important differences. We won't have to over-invest as much. Plus I think this is something which people oftentimes don't appreciate as much. There are tremendous benefits of being a democracy, which is, sometimes, for instance, people say, and I'm in my opinion, some of this is basically very motivated narratives about the quality of data, etc. I have seen, in a democracy, you cannot fudge, you cannot basically create narratives that are different. Why? Because all it requires, as I say, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. Right. So in a democracy, all it requires is one person squealing, saying that this is not the narrative. That's all. And I've been in the government, have seen it actually, that there are so many links. So a democracy has its cost, which is that sometimes we cannot make decisions as fast, right? Because we have to take everybody along the way. But the benefit of that is this stuff of this opacity that a country that is not a democracy can have, and thereby sort of narratives can incorrect narratives can prevail, transparency cannot come about. That is something that cannot happen. So for instance, and that's why the chapter I wrote on India's GDP numbers, and those people who say that India's GDP, I don't know what they are smoking, because if you just do the arithmetic, it's there's something I think. See, if you basically say that, let's say that GDP growth is overestimated by 2.5%. Just think about it with compounding. Let's say this year GDP, let's say, is 100 rupees, suppose. Okay. And let's say, for argument purposes, actual GDP was only 5%. GDP growth was only 5%. And let's say the number was reported to be 7.5%. Okay. Which means 2.5%. Let's say let's say you overstated it, right? What happened then? You basically, the actual GDP is 105, and the reported GDP is 107.5. Next year, if you have to again, actual is only 5. If you have to report 7.5 again. Then what? You actually have to report next year's GDP as almost 116. Right. Okay. 116. While the actual GDP will actually be 111. So in the first year, estimation that was required was 2.5. In the second year, already it's actually 6. So you do the compounding, and some of these people who basically say that GDP growth numbers are basically are overestimated by 2.5%. They don't even understand the basic arithmetic here. Of basically the GDP growth numbers. So in just 2 years, first year you actually had to, let's say, overestimate it by 2.5. The second year you had to overestimate by close to 6, and then by 4 years it'll become about 15. Just do the math, actually just do the arithmetic and you get to know what. So this is just sort of the analytical explanation. to actually to complement what I'm saying, that in a democracy, you can't basically do the kind of stuff. It's because there will always be people, who will be conscientious enough, and a democracy, gives them the freedom to basically go and squeal if they basically don't agree with the narrative. So, and therefore again I'll say a chain is only as strong as the weakest link. So in a democracy, this kind of stuff cannot happen. That's why, and that's why it leads to cleanup. For instance, right, the crony lending happened for a period. Actually, banks continued to not reveal some of the bad debt, etc. But sometimes actually, no, we have to clean up, and cleanup happened. But if it is not a democracy, this phenomenon can continue for a very long time. Because the difference is that, if it is not a democracy, that weak link in the chain actually may be very, very scared, saying, if I squeal, I don't know whether I'll live tomorrow or not. Right? That such kind of fears are not there here, actually.
Talking about your book, sir, where you kind of changed all the narratives. To sum up, what I understood was that the direction of causality is from loans towards deposit and not the vice versa. But after reading it for a couple of times, I somewhat understand the principle. But I'm still wondering, what's the application of this changed economic narrative towards the people who are just starting out their careers? Can you help them how this narrative that you have changed in your book can help a 22-year-old in their lives?
Let's start from the premise that each one of us, keeps money in our wallets.
Right.
Even if nowadays basically not as much physical money, maybe on Paytm or Google Pay, or we have money in our bank accounts. Now the question basically that comes, something when you start thinking about inflation and economic growth, inequality, phenomena that all of us care about, in our society, those get impacted by the way in which money is created. Existing theory essentially tells us that it is, money is essentially being created by the central bank. But what we show is actually money is being created by banks.
80%.
Banking sector, almost 90%. 90%. And why? Because if you take what is called broad money is, which includes the money that is there in the deposits, in our bank deposits, the money that is there in our purses, the currency note, that's put together, that is basically broad money, right? Which is, of that broad money, almost 90% is actually in the bank deposits. And I think intuitively also you can understand, if you look at maybe in everybody's own, maybe 10% of your, overall, sort of money that you have, you're carrying in your pocket, maybe even less than that. While you're putting a lot more, in the bank deposit, right? And it is the banks that are creating the money, which means that, the way in which a bank lends is something that is extremely important. Because, so if a bank goes and lends to a Vijay Mallya, it is not creating money in the economy. Because, and it's not, let me put it, it's actually not creating enough money, because Vijay Mallya basically, he didn't go and, take that money and create a real viable business, right? If, for instance, let's say, money is taken by a good entrepreneur. Let's say you go and borrow money, you go and create a fintech firm, or maybe an entrepreneurial firm where you provide jobs to, let's say, 1,000 people, right? So you took this money, you've created employment, 1,000 people. Those 1,000 people are themselves in keeping money in the bank account. They'll go and borrow, maybe some of those 1,000, actually maybe 10 or, maybe 100 of them will go and create the firms themselves, right? So, by, again, coming back to that ethical wealth creation. So if you basically take money, that is the loan that the bank has given, and ethically create a good enterprise, right? Then you are creating prosperity, and that furthers the process of money creation, right? In contrast, if basically someone behaves like a Vijay Mallya, then they are actually just putting some money maybe in their pocket, or maybe in a bank in Cayman Islands, or that's not creating money. If anything, actually, when you didn't pay salaries to employees, etc., many of them basically their families came under a lot of trouble. So the lesson that actually I want to leave for youngsters is, if you go and work in the banking system or in the financial sectors, etc., give loans to what I like thinking about as firms that are children today, which can grow to become giants.
Right.
Don't give money to dwarfs. What's the difference between a dwarf and a child? A child is one which basically will grow and become a giant. A dwarf will remain basically the same size.
How do you predict this?
That's what banking, you go and learn that. No, I mean, if I could teach all of that, actually, why do you need to go and learn an MBA? Yeah, give an MBA. So, that the entire process of actually learning how to assess credit risk, all that is actually, that's part of learning. Nowadays, all of you want crash capsules actually. Not as bankers, give loans to these children who can grow to become giants. And as entrepreneurs, actually, don't be a Vijay Mallya.
Right.
Don't be a Nirav Modi. Be a Narayan Murthy. Any one of the many others who have created real firms that have actually created prosperity. Basically, do good, and in the process also, become wealthy. Last bit actually, which is because just when you mentioned about this crash capsules, right? If you want to really learn something well, crash capsules are not going to help. You have to go through the full rigor of learning the thing yourself.
Last set of advice for teachers, professor, because you have been the professor of the year, and I have had an opportunity to meet some of your students, and they will like your quality of teaching anything to first principles with extreme patience, with giving some great analogies from real world. How can teachers who are teaching in colleges, in any colleges, can make their content interesting? What's the secret sauce of you being the professor of the year, teacher of the year multiple times? आप ऐसा क्या पढ़ाते हैं? क्या नहीं? आप ऐसा कैसे पढ़ाते हैं कि you are able to achieve that? What can teachers learn from that?
Teaching is about exposition as well. It's not just about understanding the concept. You have to understand the concept really well first. And when I say understanding, which is that if I can explain a concept without using any jargon whatsoever, any jargon, which means just plain simple English or plain simple Hindi, common words, if I can explain, only then have I understood the concept really well. That is the benchmark I keep for myself. That till that time, so as a student, if I have to go and teach the concept, I learn it. I learn the concept actually, and stay with that concept so long that I can actually explain it even to a class 8 kid, or maybe, a class 10 kid, or maybe my grandmother as well. Actually, I can go. So I need to be able to understand it that well. That's the first most important. Being able to explain it without any jargon, just plain English, plain Hindi. The second thing is then to also think about how are you going to take your understanding and explain it to someone else. So, and that also requires a lot of thinking. It's good teaching is not just about good understanding of the concept, but also learning how to explain it well. And that oftentimes I think teachers maybe don't invest as much, right? Let me give you examples from, I've seen others, when people, for instance, I've seen these videos of people teaching, in physics, these teachers in Kota, some of these, even an, sort of MIT professor teaching, rigid body motion. They actually show rigid body motion, actually demonstrated rigid body motion, and that's how a physics teacher is actually giving a practical demonstration.
Right.
If you're a professor of maths or economics or whatever, you have to actually make the concept relatable to, and one of the secrets that I have actually learned is that we all learn new concepts using old concepts.
Right.
So to give you an example, for instance, if I'm learning algebra, in order to learn algebra, I have to actually first understand arithmetic really well. I cannot learn algebra without learning arithmetic,
Right.
which means arithmetic is the old concept with which I learn the new concept algebra. When I come to calculus, algebra is the old concept with which I learn calculus, right? That same metaphor applies actually everywhere else. That when I'm teaching a new concept, I want to teach that concept using concepts that the student already knows, and then introduce them. Anything new is learned by using what is old. That's the key. So if I, for instance, have used I gave you the two examples I mentioned, Damini movie, right? For somebody who's watched the movie or at least seen the clip, right? That's an old concept, Tariq pe Tariq, Tariq pe Tariq, Tariq pe Tariq. So, and using that old concept, introduce the new idea of basically, of what is wrong with the judicial system. Or if I take Shruti Kakkad, in Band Bajra Barat, again that's an old concept, which is basically, people have seen it, to explain, entrepreneurship, in the grassroots. So,
Right.
Teachers have to actually think very carefully about the examples, to give. Related to that also is another principle that I use is, good learning always happens from the concrete to the abstract.
Can you break that down?
Which means that, so if I, for instance, give you the example of, let's a plus b whole squared is a squared plus b squared plus 2ab, let's say, right? If I, for instance, understand how a square looks, a square, right? So I can take, for instance, let's say, if I let's say have Lego blocks, I take Lego blocks and maybe put, Lego blocks together. 4 Lego blocks, 1 inch, maybe I put it together, or maybe 1 centimeter, I get a square. So what is it? Basically, by taking 2 into 2, I've actually gotten a square. So it's a concrete thing, right? It's a concrete way in which you're actually learning the concept of squaring. You introduce that and then explain the abstract concept, because x plus y whole squared, is basically something that is abstract. If you take, for instance, that's the way the way in which we are taught, the way the pedagogy has been designed itself. We first taught arithmetic. We do, 1 plus 2, is equal to 3, right? And from that, then we basically learn, x plus y whole squared. You learn the concept of numbers, which is concrete. And then, the concept of a variable, which can take any number, is something that you learn, after having learned the concrete concept. So I think that idea in whatever field you are in, as a teacher, first introduce a concrete thing, and from there, then bring the abstract concept. Oftentimes, I think people basically do it the other way, which is first introduce the abstract concept, and then, people basically sort of start. I think in a classroom, if you lost your student in the first, let's say 10 minutes or so, it's hard to get them back actually, because sort of cascading happens, and that's the other simple principle which I've always used is to first say it and then say it again. It is important to actually repeat these things. So I think it's also if you're a good student, which is you keep learning how to become better, and I think that's the part that I would mention.
Thanks a lot. Really grateful that you accepted our invite. Super insightful conversation. I learned a lot. There are a lot of things that I'll go back, rewatch, and figure out. मेरे को बहुत सारे सवाल पूछने थे. But जिनको economics सीखनी है, if you were to tell 5 resources, because बहुत सारे crash capsules थे जो हम cover नहीं कर पाए. But you gave the tip points, and hopefully we'll get an opportunity to record another episodes maybe in the future. But अगर उनको चीज करनी है, तो what are those 5 concepts and what are those 5 resources around those concepts which students can learn? जिनको economics सीखनी, जिनको basic fundamentals को सीखना. What?
One thing I want to tell you actually is, there are no shortcuts in life. I think if you want to be really good at something, shortcuts are not going to get you there. So I'm not going to answer that question, because that will basically be going against the principle of shortcuts. If you have to become good at economics, pick up a good textbook, read it from cover to cover, first page to last page, not miss a single word. That's how you become really good at it. For instance, if I go back to my physics, I picked up Halliday and Resnick. Halliday, Resnick, first page to last page, without missing a single word, without missing a single problem, without missing a single example. I did the full thing, not just once but twice. तब जाके physics में वो पकड़ा. ठीक है. There are no shortcuts.
And
economics, actually, there are many textbooks. You can pick up, for instance, Samuelson's book, on microeconomics. That's what we learned. I'm sure there are many, there are newer books as well. For instance, at the PhD level, there is basically the Malskolel, Winston, and Green that is used. Similarly, Hal Varian. I think Hal Varian has books on both for the undergrad level and the postgraduate level. But this is a principle I have always followed, which is, rather than reading 2 different books, read one good book twice. But cover to cover. Not miss a single example, not miss a single problem. Diligence, you don't become a scholar you don't become good at anything actually without being diligent. As simple as that.
Super insightful. Thanks a lot.